Introduce myself because he can't remember anything about me because he's getting too old. Yeah. Oh, that's what it is. That's why you invited me. You hear about that little girl in school? She was drawing a picture, and teacher come by and looks and says, "What is that?" The little girl says, "It's a picture of God." And the teacher says, "Well, nobody knows what God looks like." The little girl says, "They will in a minute." You guys all know Michael Hodgeterp. This is one of my good buddies. We've met on the trail and we've become forever good buddies. And especially because he plays percussion. No, that's not especially why. Just for all kinds of good reasons. It's an honor to come and be with you guys. It just brings back such great memories of all those years of being in the field and, you know, just shouldering all these things together and to see that it's finally turning into something for real. And I love going out there and touching the hearts of the people. And one of the things I want to do for you right now is I want to sing a song that I've just recently written. I wrote it maybe a year and a half ago, but that's recent for me because I'm getting old. So anyway, it's called "The Call of the Drum," and a quote that the Creator has given to me in recent times is that the drum is the symbol of the restoration of the Native American people. And I really believe that because there's been so much opposition to bringing the drum and using it as an instrument to worship God with. I mean, maybe for you guys aren't seeing it, but for me, I've been put out of too many places now because I go in with a drum. But you know, good things are happening. We're on a really, really amazing journey now because I believe the doors are opening and times they are changing. So many people in a hopeless place battle bitter feelings of people displaced. They're living in the shadows of broken promises. They've stopped trying to pick up the pieces. There is a way back to who you were meant to be. When you look into the mirror, here's what you should see through the eyes of your Creator, for it is He who's calling you back to who you were meant to be. Hear the call of the drum, so sacred to the people. Hear the singers cry out, calling you home. To the sound of freedom, come and dance, and let's be one. Oh, hear the call of the drum. It's a call to honor, come and dance, to promises fulfilled. As we cry out, we're calling for justice, where honor, love, and life are restored. Many years you've wandered aimlessly, lost and forgotten, was never meant to be. The gifts within you that you've never seen, they are waiting for release, they are waiting to be free. Hear the call of the drum, so sacred to the people. Hear the singers cry out, calling you home. Come and dance to the sound of freedom. Come and dance, and let's be one. Oh, hear the call of the drum.
justice, where honor, love, and life are restored. Oh, when I own it, when I own it, when I own it, oh.
Thank you. I was talking to somebody for a radio or a television interview, and they were giving me the pre-interview so that they would know, have an idea of what we were going to chat about. And as we were talking, and they were asking me questions about what it's like in our native communities, I said, well, in many places, our people are strangers to themselves because who they are has been stolen right out from under them. And when I said that, it was something that was like totally off the wall. I had not thought of it ahead of time. When I said our people are strangers to themselves, it was like I stopped and we didn't say a word for like 30 to 45 seconds on this phone conversation. And it was like taking a deep breath. And so, of course, whenever I have those moments, it always inspires a song. Not strangers to ourselves, not broken beyond repair, no longer self-destructive, but restored with love and care, delivered from the lies, holding captive hearts and lives. We're free, we're free, we're free, we're free. As words of truth are spoken, lies are broken, and we can live our lives loved and free. No longer just a token, the curse on life is broken in our lives, in our lives, in our lives, in our lives. We're free, we're free. It's what you've done, you see. Today our hearts are open, today our eyes can see. We're free, we're free, we're free, we're free. We're a people proud and free, with hope for family. Our sons and daughters proud of who they are meant to be. We're living our lives as it was meant to be, not strangers to ourselves in our home and native land. We're free, we're free. It's what you've done, you see. Today our hearts are open, today our eyes can see. We're free, we're free, we're free, we're free. Yahweh, 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 Yahweh. Yahweh, Yahweh, Thank you. Terry asked me if I'd be playing my flute, but he told me 2 songs, so I had to go one way or another.
So I thought I would do the post-duction instead of the introduction because we have an announcement about it. I met Jonathan long after I met Jonathan's dad, Andrew Maracle Sr., who'd been on the trail not only of the preaching ministry with the Pentecostal Church, but also as an activist and promoter for Indigenous rights. As a Mohawk leader, Andrew Maracle Sr. was so profoundly influential and so profoundly dedicated to the cause that the last thing that Andrew Maracle Sr. did was to speak at a public event. And in so doing, as he always did, advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples, not just in Canada, but in the United States and elsewhere. And he went after having finished a rousing speech, and if any of you knew Andrew Maracle Sr., you'd know that any speech he gave was a rousing speech. And after a rousing speech, went and sat down in the chair appointed to him on the platform and left this life and entered the next. And that's the way he lived, and that's the way he passed into the next journey. I met John in the course of all of that, after having spent time with Andrew Maracle Sr. over the years, visiting. And John had come back from the rock and roll trail. I just remember the return and the taking up together with his wife Linda of the call to ministry with the musical gifts and talents that John has, as I'm sure you can attest if you've never heard him before. So John's going to be with us at the 3rd annual Camp and Powwow in Pine Lake, Alberta this August. You'll be able to catch the dates on our website as well as on the Salvation Army website. This is a camp and powwow that Indigenous Pathways and the Salvation Army in Canada, Sherry Russell, who is our board chair, is the liaison throughout Canada for Indigenous Affairs for the Salvation Army. And we have now, in this 3rd year, co-sponsored the powwow along with the camp. So if you're looking for an opportunity to connect in a powwow setting and in a camp setting with a bunch of the folks that you'll see here, that's Sherry, what are the dates again? August 23rd to 25, Pine Lake, Alberta. So we'll hope to see you there. Registration is open. You can go on the Salvation Army site. We haven't duplicated that registration connect yet on our site, but there will be a link to that on the NAIITS site and the Indigenous Pathways site shortly. So be aware of that. And it'll also be on the Wachoni site coming right up. So, well, welcome back this morning. How about them Raptors, eh? Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Like to go and to kick some serious butt in your opponent's house. Wow. That was an awesome game. We watched the last half of it, or almost half of it, and boy, it was a nail-biter for a bit, but what a game. So, we're here on the on the opening of the closing day, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our first plenary in a moment. But throughout the day today, we have an absolutely bang-up lineup of folks in our marketplace presentations toward the end of the day. But before we get into all of that, Ray Minicon is going to come and lead us in a reflection to launch us into the day, along with the wonderful music that we had with John, both these last 2 songs and the drum. Ray and I got to meet one another back in the 1990s, the early 1990s, and I think it was 1991, although his and my memory are fading fast. His more than mine. He's older than me. He's ancient of days. We met back in 1991. Ray was working with World Vision Australia, and I was doing some consulting work for World Vision in Canada at the time, among other things. And we met in Vancouver, BC. Ray was over for a conference, and we compared notes. And as is the case many times when Indigenous folks from around the world connect, they compare notes. What are the experiences that you've had through life? What are the issues that you're struggling through? How are you succeeding in representing your people? And sorry, James, if I've created a problem. No, I'm just. Christine, manage that guy, would you? You compare notes, and it's one of the things that we got to do very early on was to ask of one another, where are we seeing our people move toward health and well-being? What are the things that are happening? And what I've always loved about Ray, as he and Sharon, his wife, and their children, Joan, Larissa and John and Joash, and our kids got to know one another and hang together. One of the things I've always appreciated is the diligence of Ray in the ministry. Ray is, more than anyone else, pastor to Australia, Australia's Indigenous people. More than anyone else I know. He travels wherever he needs to serve Indigenous peoples throughout the land. So would you give a warm welcome to Ray as he comes to share with us?
Just a short one. We do compare. I mean, one of my jokes was that when the British invaded our country, they brought all these criminals over, prisoners. And when the British invaded your country, they came over with pilgrims. And so the joke was that, whether it was pilgrims or prisoners, the impact upon our people was the same. And so you have to wonder about those kind of challenges sometimes. But this morning, it's good to see some of our old faces here that I've connected with for over so many years. And it's such a good moment for me to be here, to be with you all again. And before I start, I just want to say a little story, just in memory of one of my great friends from over this way here, and Richard Twist. When Richard got up to speak, he always told a joke. So here's my little joke. There was a little Aboriginal guy, walking down the street, and there was a church there having a big healing service. And so he looks in and says, I might go in. Goes into this healing service, and at the healing service there was this visiting American minister, preacher, evangelist, and he went in, sat down, and as they do, in these Pentecostal services, they gave an altar call. And so he goes out to the front with all the other people there, and the minister's going up and down the track there and praying for everybody, and they're all falling over the place. He comes up to the little Aboriginal guy, he says, listen, what would you like me to pray for? And the little Aboriginal guy says, can you pray for my hearing? He says, yeah, no worries. He looks to the congregation and he says, now listen, I want you to put your hand out here. This young fella here wants us to pray for his hearing. Let's believe that the Lord will hear his prayer and heal him. And so the minister puts his hand on his head and fingers in his ears, and he starts praying for his hearing. After 10 minutes of shouting and everything of this nature, and all the demons were leaving the church and everything of that nature, the preacher pulls his finger out, takes his hands off his head, and he says, young man, how is your hearing? The young fellow says, I don't know, it's not until next Tuesday. Mark and Patricia, these people now understand Australian. I just wanted to test them. But I would like to share some reflections this morning on a personal journey, really. My wife and I, and my family really, we've been involved in Australia with our stolen generations, which you call over here your scooped up ones or your residential schools. We have the same situation in Australia. 39 years we've been working with our stolen generations. And I just thought I'd share a few reflections on some of the things that I've learnt from working with these beautiful, beautiful people, beautiful members of our community. And I share this also because we're talking about land and those issues. But when I'm talking about the stolen generations, or in your case, the residential school survivors, we're talking about a people whose soul has been raped so brutally that's left them crippled for life. A rape so profound, as one professor puts it, so deep, so brutal. And in my thinking, as I reflect on this land and people, I'm thinking too that if we want to heal our land, we also got to heal our people. And these are the people who are the most damaged in our community, the most brutalized, where the depth of our pain resides in their soul and in their stories. And so the Lord led us into this particular story so many years ago. I won't say names here, but I'll do generic names. I want to tell you the story of Uncle Charlie. He was a shearer, and he lived on the farm there in a little hut with dirt floors with his family. One day he's out there shearing his sheep. While he was out there, the government car comes in and takes all of his children. When he comes back from shearing, walks into the house and sees his beautiful wife, just in complete pain. Children have gone. So as you can imagine, Charlie's just destroyed himself, and the only image he has of his children are these footprints on the floor of his house, the dirt floor. And so he gets a carpet and he puts it over it. And the only time he can remember his children, because he has no photograph of them, is when he pulls that carpet back and sees their feet implanted on the floor. And he would do that every day, just to remember them, who these children were. So they were taken, put into institutions and homes and all kinds of stuff. Eventually, after many, many years and changes in politics and stuff, he did reunite with his family. But he tells that story in such tears. It was this story actually highlights some of the incredible challenges that we face when we're dealing with, from our side, the stolen generations. Because you have trauma here, you have this rape of the soul that's so profound, so deep. Not only of the children being taken from their parents, but also of the parents not being connected to their children. So how do you work with that? How do you deal with that? How do you live with that? In New South Wales, when I came back into New South Wales and started working with the stolen generations there, the New South Wales government had 3 specific homes for our Aboriginal children. One was called Bomaderry Homes. This is where they were taken as babies. The other one was called Kinchela Boys Home. This is when they got to a certain age, from 8 upwards, the boys would be taken from this home and put in Kinchela Boys Home. The girls would be taken and put in another home called Cootamundra Girls Home. So families were just split up. They might have went in there as children, as families, but they were split up into these very different homes. And so I entered into that story through many of my uncles and my aunties there in New South Wales and working with them so many years, hearing their stories and feeling their pain, but not only them, but so many others. And I had to think on this matter here from a biblical viewpoint. How do I enter into this story and understand what's going on here? I went through theological college in Western Australia, Baptist Theo College, and through Murdoch University. Graduated from there. And the principal of the college there, Dr. Noel Vos, he implanted one thought in my mind that has never left us. He said to us, Ray, you've got to think theologically. Think theologically. It drummed it into my mind. And as I reflect upon that particular moment way back there in the early 80s and this story, I realise that you don't, as Aboriginal people, as Indigenous people, we don't only think theologically, we already think theologically, but we also act and we behave theologically. And so, entering into the story, I had to think theologically again about the incredibly profound pain that I walked into when you're forcibly removed from your family and your children. I won't mention it. There's one other story I'll tell you about later on. I just want to say that the experiences that we experienced here, I know happened here too, because I too have heard many of the stories here, met many of the people here who have been forcibly removed from their homes, from their families, from their communities, from their tribe, from their culture, and put into these residential schools. It's the same story, the similar story, the similar challenges, similar issues. The first thing that the Lord taught us to think about theologically is to enter into the sufferings of this people here. There's a text that Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 3, verse 7 to 11. He says, I want to know Christ. I want to know who Jesus is. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. Become like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. So that was my first lesson. By dealing with these particular issues that our people were facing, the sufferings of our people, the Lord taught us to enter into the suffering because I was learning to participate in the fellowship of his sufferings. That was the first lesson. And so that helped us to get an ear and a heart to understand the enormous pain and challenges that each of them faced. The other lesson I learnt was that how do you deal with children who have been taken but who have been innocent? They haven't done anything. Now in our country, when they moved the children from Bomaderry homes up to Kinchela boys' homes or to Cootamundra girls' home, they were under police escort because they were criminals. They didn't even know it. And so they were treated in this particular way. They were taken to the court. The judge says, take them and put them in this home. That was the law, and that's the way it worked. So in reflecting upon this notion of innocence, it took me to the book of Job. Job was an innocent man. He'd done nothing wrong throughout all of his life. Even God said that about Job He said that the Lord said to Satan, he said, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless, upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Innocent. He didn't even have to go to court to prove that. The Lord had already declared him an innocent, upright man. Second chapter of Job, he loses everything. He loses his children, all of his wealth. The last picture you see of Job in chapter 2 is that he's sitting there in the burnt out ashes of his wonderful big ranch house, and he's scratching all these sores with a bit of cow manure. Now that's how you treat an innocent man. But that is the image, the picture of a lot of our stolen generations. There's another home over there, and I'll just mention this just briefly. It was called the Parramatta Girls' Home. And I had this, me and another uncle of mine had this honour that they called us into their circle once, all women. And I must admit today that when I walked into that meeting with those women there, I'd never ever seen such brutalised people in my life. You just got to imagine a girls' home, all the guards were male. I'll leave it at that. Many of those women were what we call over there feral. They couldn't even look at me because I was a male. That's how brutalised they were. But they were innocent. They had done nothing wrong. And so the story of Job comes into play here as to how an innocent person deals with the ways in which he has been dealt with. No. So the Lord led us to that one, taught us from that particular book how the innocent suffer. The only part of Job that I didn't like was the end part, that Hollywood ending. I still can't get my head around the Hollywood ending, but that's a different story. My theological intelligence won't allow me to accept that as a part of the story, because I'm working with people who've been brutalised. And I can't understand how Job could ever forget what happened to him. It's just impossible. The other story that I kept on reading and trying to understand was the book of Lamentations. Lamentations, as well as Job, gave me the language of suffering, pain, our people's loss of community, the trauma, the suffering, all came out of these books. And I could understand then the community suffering that all of our communities faced when not only their children were taken, but also your culture, your language, everything is gone. And you're sitting there in the burnt out ashes of your community, trying to figure out what the heck have we done wrong. And I've often said this to our people back home, back to our nation back home, we're not the fault. We're not the ones at fault here. We didn't do anything wrong. We're innocent people as a nation. So why the freaking heck did you come and invade us? And deal with us in such a brutal way for so many years? We're innocent people. They won't even make a flaming treaty with us, but in all of this suffering of our people and walking alongside, we have to think theologically about it, because when we're talking about land and people, if we can heal our people, we've got to bring them back to a land and heal the land as well alongside them. The other book that was really important for us was Nehemiah, where you then start to look at how do you build and rebuild your community. And there's a beautiful part in that book that says these two words, that Nehemiah rebuilt the walls with burnt stones, scarred stones. And I thought, man, what a powerful image of the things that we're facing, that we can rebuild community again through these scarred stones. And in my work with our stolen generation, one of the ways in which I helped with, I don't like the word healing, because our men, when I was working with the Kinchler men for numbers of years there, we didn't use the word healing, because for them, there was no such thing as healing. Or this English word that we use called healing. There is no such thing. You can't just pray for someone and say, well, you're healed. It's not that simple. And so I resist that word healing when I'm working with my stolen generation people, because the memory is always there. Wherever they go, wherever they look, there's always the pain that they have suffered. And so Nehemiah gave us an insight into the scarred stones, that you can rebuild your community with scarred stones, with burnt stones. The other passage is that I wanted to understand where Jesus sat with all of this pain, because he seemed like an alien to us, particularly to the stolen generation. The church was a part of the problem. They preached Jesus, but he was an alien. He didn't fit into it. And for me, I had to understand, well, Lord, how do I start to think theologically about who you are in this whole mess that we're facing here in this country? And he led us back to this particular passage here, which is Paul again writing to the Colossian Christians. And he said, Paul says it this way, that hymn in Colossians was very powerful for me. He says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether they're thrones, powers, rulers, authorities, churches, institutions, commonwealth, government. All things were created through him and for him. And that settled it for me. I could then understand that I'm in the midst of a powerful understanding of this Christ who is here in the midst of the suffering. And I'm suffering with him, and I'm suffering with my people. A lot of our children were also taken overseas, and I've met many of our ones who've been taken to England and other parts of the planet and came home and trying to reconnect. One particular brother who came back from England, he's still lost. I'm trying to get him back to his community. But the distance in his spirit between who he is. He was taken from a hospital in North Shore, and then his mother was told that she had a stillborn child. Lies. When he comes back into Australia from England, he finds out that he has a number of other siblings, and he's saying to me, Ray, how do I connect? He says, my mother doesn't even know who I am. I can't even talk to her, and she can't with me. What do I do? How do I do that? So I sat him down and said, brother, let's write her a letter from you, a personal letter, just to let her know who you are, that you're here in Australia, you come back to reconnect. He still hasn't connected, and that's fine. That's the way it is with a lot of our stolen generations. There is no Hollywood ending here to these stories. No Hollywood ending. But he did have a lot of issues with the local Aboriginal people who wanted to fight him all the time, as well as the gangs who wanted to kill him. And we had to get him out of town, and I had to send him over to another part of the country there to get a job and get him out of the place. But all the time, you want to take him back home to meet his people. In all of this, as Christ became more real to me in that suffering, it's what Ray was saying here the other day. The Eucharist became a part of my compass in trying to navigate through all of this as well. So I'd go to an 8 o'clock service just to have the Lord's Supper, because I wanted to touch something real about who Jesus is, and that the only thing I could touch was that particular Eucharist. I better finish, although I could go on for ages here, telling stories. And I just want to say one thing. I don't tell these stories. I don't preach about the stolen generation. It's not my right to do that. That's the story that the stolen generations can tell themselves. And all my work with the stolen generation, I'm now working with the Bomaderry homes. It took me 13 years to get to establish the Kinchela Boys. And in doing that, the mission that I gave them is taking control of your future. Didn't put anything else there. I said, you fellas have never had control of your lives. All your lives, someone's controlled you. Take control of it yourselves. And a couple of years back, I've just left them to go on their own journey and do their own thing. And they're doing such a wonderful job. And then I'm working with this other home called Bomaderry Children's Home. And they have got different issues. When you're taking a child who's just a couple of months old and put them into an institution, and then years later you ask that child to tell you about their experiences and who they are, you know, they don't have a flame in memory. They don't know what happened because they were children. So how do you fix that? How do you take them home? And here we are, we know where we're from, we know where we come from, we know how we're connected. I know who I am. But how do I help them to go home too? I've had to walk with some of these men, even when the Rudd apologised to them, they wouldn't even walk in the door there to hear the apology. I said, come on, let's go and sit. I'll sit with you. I'll finish with this last story because I think this is one of the biggest lessons I've learned with working with our stolen generation members in Australia. This old uncle, I was taking him back to Kinchela Boys Home for the first time. Now this old uncle, in his community, he had been the local drunk for the last 40 odd years. Everybody knew him as the local drunk. One day we had a meeting with all the men, and the men, all jailbirds, all drunks themselves, decided to elect him as the vice chair. You know, this 40-year-old drunk sobered up within a week. Made me question, what do you mean by alcoholism? And then I took him back to Kinchela, and just about a few miles outside of this place called Kempsey, where the Kinchela Boys Home was, as he was driving, well, the other thing about this old uncle, when he became sober and you couldn't shut him up. He talked all the way from Sydney all the way up to Kempsey and back again. But when we got about a few miles out of Kempsey, he says, Unc, he's calling me uncle, he's older than me, I can't go any further unless I have, one of the old uncles with me. That's Uncle Johnny, Uncle Jack, and Uncle Jim. Johnny Walker, Jim Bean, Jack Daniels. It's amazing how those old relatives have become part of us, part of our family, an unwanted part at that. But that's what he wanted, one of the old uncles there to help him to walk through the door. Well, we didn't have Uncle Johnny or Uncle Jim or Uncle Jack. So I said, I'll drive. And we drove up to the gate. Now, years prior to this, I'd already taken a lot of the other men back to this place. And here's this man. All the things that happened to him, all the things that he saw, the rapes, the punishments, all of those things just flooded back into his spirit. You had to hold his hand, wait, and then we walked through that building. He didn't want to go back there. He didn't want to take anyone back there, but he did. But after that, the thing that this old uncle taught me is that he then went and got all the other men he could find and says, we got to go back to Kinchela. That's where our healing is. And isn't that fascinating? Because what that old uncle was saying was, the place of pain is the place of healing. The place of pain is the place of healing. He didn't know how deeply theological that meant to me, because that's the cross. The place of pain is the place of healing. God bless you.
So for those of you who are checking your watches at the moment, would you please take them off and discard them in the trash bin on the way out? We're right on time. It's inevitable. Just a couple of things just to quickly follow up with Ray and connect it to some theological reflection that is important for us to be aware of. Some of you will be aware of Freedom Road and the work of people like Steve Bell as advocates on behalf of Indigenous folks and others on with Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, Northwestern Ontario. And Steve dropped a note to say that the opening of Freedom Road and Chief Red Sky's a wonderful, gracious response that while we cannot change 100 years of history, which subjected their people to polluted waters, inaccessible reserve community, and so on, just so that Winnipeg could receive a pure water supply, can't be addressed, but they are hopeful about what it looks like going forward. They are hopeful that this now will launch them on an opportunity for justice to be realized, not just in the development of Freedom Road, but in the development of their community. And then Steve Heinrichs writes us to talk to us in a challenging way to get behind Bill C-262. And of course, yesterday we talked about that. Mike came and read a response that we will be sending off to Don Plett, the whip of the Canadian Senate, who, together with a handful of others in the Canadian Senate as a part of the Conservatives, are roadblocking the passage of Bill C-262. And the issue here is, if you really want reconciliation, then it requires some change. And this bill signifies change. And so I reflected on this as Ray is talking theologically to us this morning about the stolen generations and about their engagement in the land and about the implications of a colonial history that continue to bear out day after day, week after week, year after year in our communities. I'm mindful of when I turned my life to Christ in a repentant way and said, boy, I've screwed up sometimes, and I want to do a better job. One of the prerequisites for actually walking that trail out was to change my behavior. We cannot continue to do what we did and say that reconciliation with God or human beings or the creation that we're a part of, given our theme this week, is a real concern for us. Let's get behind this. Those of you who are Canadian citizens in this room, let's get behind this, Bill 262. And tell Don Plett and the rest of the crowd that are blocking it that this is an issue of justice. And if we're really serious about reconciliation in Canada, this is a prerequisite. Okay, with that, before we introduce our plenary to be on time for the rest of the week, what do we need for announcements, Beth? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Good morning. Chris, could we have the reminder that we're recycling lanyards slide? We are recycling lanyards. If anybody is not needing to take theirs home, not wanting to take theirs home, please leave it with us instead of taking it home and putting it in your bottom drawer. We'll be able to use it again next year. Is it Shandai? Shandy? Sean Dean Church made them lovingly for us, and Casey brought them up, so we're very pleased about that. We do have on the wall at the back a list of people who would need a ride to the airport, people who could give a ride to the airport. Most people, being very personable and relational, are coming and telling us those informations, and honestly, I'm now too old to retain that information. So if you could write it on the wall there, that would be super helpful, because otherwise I'm afraid we might forget you. So we are trying to see who might be able to help each other with that. So please write it on the wall so that we can make sure you're taken care of. This morning, when it is time for the break, the coffee will be served down in the cafeteria as you go to your first marketplace session. So you'll go down and get your coffee and then go to your marketplace session. The papers are ready now. The people that asked for USB, they're on the table. The actual physical papers will be ready later this morning, and it is uploaded already to the website. We are missing 2 gowns from last night that we're going to get in trouble for if we don't find them. So if you borrowed one of the gowns that was in the room, please bring it back to us so we can return it to the seminary. Also, we may not have made this clear, and now I'm going to make it clear. We rented those hoods that you were hooded with, because NAITS doesn't have its own hoods at this point. So you don't actually take them home. We actually have to send them back. So you get to take the blankets home and you get to take the diploma covers home, but the hoods are just sort of symbolic for the moment, because we don't actually have our own. And I'll give you in big trouble if I don't send them all back. So if you have one of the grad hoods, we do need to get it back from you this morning, please. We did, normally when we come here at 11 a.m., we're supposed to check out of our room, give back our key. We were able to work it out so we can do that after we're finished this afternoon. However, I would ask you to please, at lunchtime, gather your things up and be pretty much ready to go, so that right after you can grab your suitcase and be gone. But because they're doing us a favor by letting us stay until that time. But if we could be pretty efficient about that at the end of the day, that'd be great. I really believe that people should be allowed to volunteer for things, and I always say that no is always an acceptable answer, but this morning is an exception to that. So I would like the following people to come and see me, because I have a little task for you. One of them is Nathan, who's smiling at me right now, Patricia Courtney, Diane Campeau, Diane Clemenhage, Kimberly, Kelsey, and Jim Perkinson. I have a wee job for you if you could come and see me at the break. If you're speaking in the marketplace, all of the rooms are set up for PowerPoint, etc., and Chris is your IT guy. So if you have any needs like that, please speak to Chris at any point this morning. You'll find out where the rooms are for the marketplace. They're right here and one downstairs. So it's really straightforward. When you come out from here, you'll see where you need to go for your 2 marketplace. We need to do the switch over fairly quickly. So it's good when you're finished at the one, go on to the other. It's not the best time to stop and be super relational, because we want to get them both in before. Yeah, I know, but these are the housekeeping announcements. You're allowed to say things like that when you're housekeeping. So move along to your second one, so that we can make sure that those people have their full time to be able to share what they've brought with us. We do have the Say magazine, which is a special edition of places where there are opportunities, in particular for Indigenous persons in education. And we do have a wee spread in there that talks about NAITS, a very nice piece. And so we have a lot of copies of it. If you'd like to take one, maybe there's someone you'd like to show it to, maybe you'd just like to have one, but because NAITS is featured in there, it's a nice piece for you to take with you to share NAITS with somebody. And speaking of sharing, there also are some cards and envelopes for the Elijah Harper Scholarship Fund. Maybe you know somebody that you'd like to share that opportunity with. We have an ongoing campaign, a campaign is going very well, but that we've set a high target for ourselves in order that we'd have scholarships for our students, which, as you can imagine, is really important. So there are cards and envelopes there. If you'd like to take one or two, maybe there's someone you'd like to share that opportunity with, and we would love for you to do that. And I think that is the end of my announcements. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Beth. I think, as I mentioned yesterday, the logistics of doing one of these things is just absolutely astounding, and none of this would happen had it not been for Beth's capacity to do logistics and do them pretty doggone well. So please remember to thank Beth. Well, why don't we do that right now? A couple things. Next year's Symposium, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Sioux Falls Seminary. The topic is trauma-informed care, and how do we engage in communities that experience both historic and intergenerational and contemporary trauma. So we'll be looking at that. More to come on that in the days ahead, but that's our theme for next year. The location, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, 2, 3, and 4 of June, I believe is the dates. Is that correct? Thursday, Friday, Saturday? 4, 5, 6? Do I hear 4, 5, 6? Going once? Can't hear. 4, 5, 6 of June, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Augustana University will be co-hosting us there. So without further ado, our plenary now right on time, absolutely right on time. Our morning plenary. Mark Brett and Patricia Courtney. Patricia is standing in for Naomi Wolf, who, as you know, in our announcement Thursday night, could not be with us with the sudden unexpected death of her father back in Australia. So Naomi and Mark had worked on this presentation and done the draft of it together with us while we were doing the symposium in Melbourne this past spring, and Patricia Courtney graciously offered to step in and tag team with Mark in place of Naomi. Mark Brett, as I mentioned yesterday, is the principal advocate for us in our partnership at Whitley College at the University of Divinity in Melbourne. Over the last few years, he's become a person I consider not simply an ally, but an incredibly good friend to the Indigenous community, and not just in Australia, also here. He's a great scholar. His emphasis is on not just the Hebrew Bible, but on post-colonial studies and post-colonial writings, reflections, research, and how to engage a post-colonial reality for Indigenous folks. I consider him not just a fine scholar, but a very good friend, and I'm so appreciative that he works together with us with such passion. I got to know Patricia Courtney over the last several years as a humble yet very passionate Indigenous woman from Australia who often, as with so many, you heard me talk about that last evening with my sister Wendy, often, as with so many of our Indigenous women who have capacities and competencies that often far outstrip us men, get left behind, overlooked, set aside. And I remember the first time that I invited her into an opportunity to express those skills, those gifts, those passions in a teaching context. I remember seeing the tears in her eyes because it wasn't an often provided experience for her. She's a faculty member of NAIITS as an international learning community, concluding her PhD studies in Australia, and a graduate from our graduate certificate in theology, as you remember, on Thursday evening, and just a dear friend and sister in Christ. So, Mark and Patricia, would you come and share with us this morning?
Guatemala. That's my Beri language for hello. I would first like to acknowledge this land that I stand on today. Sorry. There we go. There, you can hear me now. In Australia, and I believe in Canada, we do the acknowledgement of country. So we always acknowledge where we stand. And I, as a guest from another Indigenous country, will always acknowledge and ask permission to stand on the lands of another First Nations people. And I give thanks for the spirits of this place, for their protection. And I am grateful to the First Nations people for the hospitality that they provide for me. Because I know their ancestors are standing watching, and I know my ancestors are standing watching. And I know the spirits of the place are also watching. And as for the theme of family, as I was praying this morning, I went outside and there was a family of geese. There was parents and there was a lot of children. So I feel very welcome and I feel part of the NAIITS family, and I give thanks. And as an Anglican priest, I also like to start, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. And as Uncle Terry said, Naomi is not with us. She is hopefully watching us as she attends to her sorry business. So when we have, in Australia, when we have to attend to sad business, we call it sorry business. And that may take a little while. So with her permission and blessing, I've been able to stand here with Mark. And it's such a privilege to stand here with Mark, because I know he's such a great ally and supporter to us as Indigenous peoples in Australia, and it's been for many, many years. So thank you, Mark. Okay, my connection with Naomi, and I'm not sure, I know I'm short, but Naomi, I've actually gone to 2 graduations. So I've got 2 sisters, and tira, we say sisters, and in our language say tira. So Mark, Naomi and I went to the first graduation for my graduate certificate in theology. And so I had the privilege and the pleasure of celebrating and being with my sister, my tira, Naomi. And then here this week, my other sister, my other tira, in such a wonderful celebration for the Graduate Certificate of Theology, Brooke. So us 3 women will always share this moments. And it might have been from one end of the world to the other, but we will always stand strong together. And I know Brooke actually wears a lot of the emu feathers, and that's part of my biri. And the connection I have with Naomi, even though I'm way up in Queensland and Naomi's from down in Tasmania, and that's where I got the t-shirt, Wild Tasmania, we share the totem of the owl. So, and you can see right up there, this is a map of Aboriginal Australia. So when you come down to my land, it's very pretty. So I live way up north, and Naomi, I don't even know if you can see it there, she lives way down in Tasmania. So that is, you actually got to either get a boat over or an aeroplane over to Tasmania, and that's way down the bottom. And because of our song lines, we actually, and the spirit people knew that. That's why they put us together. Okay. So we're going to slightly do this presentation differently from what was presented, because I will try and say what Naomi said, and I've got a couple of people in the audience that will actually let me know when my opinion starts coming in, so thanks, Andy. So we've got the paper there, and we're storytellers. So we want to let you know how this paper started, and because I've come in later, I'm going to hand it over to Mark to tell you that story.
So when Naomi and I were asked to talk to this theme related to the conference theme on land and place and an era of displacement, we talked about the different ways in which displacement might be understood. And pretty much everything that we need to know about displacement, Uncle Ray just said. And it's pretty much impossible task to follow that, brother. But in the Australian context, you may know there are huge political controversies about asylum seekers and refugees and border control, and it was even called Sovereign Borders at one point, the program to turn boats away, turn refugees away, send them back to Indonesia. So when we started talking about this, Naomi and I, we asked ourselves, how does this theme turn up in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament? And how can these things be related? And many of our friends, so Brooke, for example, works with Common Grace, and many of the people in Common Grace work with protest strategies for changing government policy on refugees and asylum seekers. And in those conversations, often people will find a reason in Scripture to resist the government. And one of the common kind of themes that you find are lists of texts, like this one in Deuteronomy. You shall love the immigrant, for you are immigrants in the land of Egypt. So it's an appeal to join in that fellowship of suffering that Ray was talking about by referring to the people's story, the Scripture. There's many texts like that, and I think in the conversations here in North America you'll find similar examples and similar references to texts like that. But as Naomi and I were talking, now what's going on here? Go back. We did that thing where you put these texts into a story theology, right? And the story that sits around that sanction to fill up the fellowship of suffering in that way in the book of Deuteronomy is joined with another story, which is the story of conquest, in which Indigenous people end up on the wrong side of the biblical story. They end up on the Canaanite side. So we asked ourselves, how are we going to talk about this complicated story theology where an appeal to suffering is in the same book as the appeal to genocide? How does that work? So one of the things we have to recognise, of course, is that this Deuteronomy's storytelling underpin the doctrines of discovery in different ways. And many of you will know the version of this story that relates to this side of the hemisphere. That line, the Tordesillas line, but on our side of the world, the other side, there's another line from the Treaty of Zaragoza which keeps going. And it's the one that cut through the island that I grew up on, Papua New Guinea, and then cut through Australia. And in the history of Australia, that cut was the first border between East and West Australia. So the first Western Australian border was a line which relates to that initial doctrine of discovery. And then it was moved later when the English contested the Dutch, who had contested the Catholics, as to who gets to police that border. That's a long story. Naomi's from Tasmania. If you're in the capital of Tasmania, in Hobart, you'll see a statue that has this bloke, this Dutch bloke, Abel Tasman, with the globe in hand. So every time you go to that market in that city, there's a little reminder to the doctrine of discovery. You can go and throw eggs at it next time you're there. So on this side of the world, you've seen paintings like this, Christopher Columbus arriving with the cross and the flag. On our side, there's the flag, not so much cross. But as Uncle Ray said, it's all the convicts behind, and they're not quite the new Israel. But the effects are pretty much the same in the long run. And then the question became, where else do you look in this story, Israel's story, for refugee concerns? And we went to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 7, if you do not oppress the alien, the stranger, the immigrant, the orphan and the widow, then I will live with you in this place, in the land that I gave your ancestors forever and ever. That's a threat. And the people didn't respond to that threat, and they were forced out of their country. And this idea that God should sanction the forced removal of people from their ancestral country is a tough idea for Aboriginal readers.
This kind of threat is almost unthinkable under Aboriginal traditions. Despite the variety of Indigenous cultures, there is a common affirmation of the intimate connection between traditional owners and their country. To be exiled from country would undermine the core of the person's being. Even for people from the stolen generations, people taken from their families, their country is always calling them. As Galloway, a traditional owner in the Northern Territory, says, you cannot avoid or deny it or run away from it. It is there whether you like it or not. This country is such that no one will ever destroy the spirit that has always been there. So how are we to understand such a harsh theology of separation for country in the Hebrew Bible?
So one thing to remember about the book of Jeremiah is that when he preached this threat it was understood by all to be heretical, unintelligible. That connection to country for his audience, and they'd been there for at least, let's say, 600 or 700 years, probably longer, they thought it was an unthinkable threat. And when people came to resist Jeremiah's threat, they said, we know about the authority of God. It comes from the priest and the prophet and the wise, and you're none of those. So we're not going to listen to you. And interestingly, there were only a few elders who defended Jeremiah by saying, oh, we've heard this kind of message before from Micah of Moreshet. And they had a debate, and this is really interesting. Where do the elders take that responsibility to debate the significance of the story of the people and defend a heretical prophet against the overwhelming consensus? Not very often, but there it is in the book of Jeremiah. Some of the elders of the land, they came from an assembly of the people, where we learn. We don't know how that assembly works. We don't know how the elders' authority worked in that assembly, but we know that they defended Jeremiah on that point, that it is necessary to protect the stranger, and it's conditional upon keeping your country. In that debate, in the assembly of the people, with the elders taking the lead, nobody cites the written law of Moses. This is something we've got to get our heads around. It's primarily an oral society. Nobody pulled out their copy of the NIV and said, it says here in Deuteronomy, if you don't look after the poor, widow and orphan, then you'll lose your country. Nobody thought to do that. Nobody at all. Only the elders thought of one precedent, which was a prophet, not what Moses had said. So this form of authority, the prophetic word, is not the authority of the priest waving a book. It's a different kind of thing. And this is the dynamic where this debate about how to protect strangers becomes central to what it means to be a follower of Yahweh.
And of course, this fits more easily with Aboriginal expectations.
We're trying to accelerate through this so that other people get to speak for the next sessions. When we come to think about how to apply the significance of some of this in Australia, it's important to get a hold of something like that dynamic in Jeremiah, where this responsibility for the stranger comes out of a consensus process, or a debate rather, within the community, within which various norms are at work. Some of them come from what the prophets say, and some of them come from other kinds of traditions. Within the Hebrew Bible, there are a number of traditions, like as we find in the book of Job that Ray was talking about, where the responsibility to protect strangers comes from an accountability to God who is not named Yahweh, but who is named El. So this story of Israel, and their many layers of stories, allow for different names for God, different names for the Creator, each of which have their own understanding of what responsibilities flow from responding to the Creator and what the Creator requires, and it becomes a debate that we need to live into, much as those people in that state of Judah had to debate as they saw the Babylonian armies bearing down on them, that sense of existential threat. As that threat approached, they were debating the core tenets of their tradition with various perspectives from the elders and so on.
In Indigenous communities, strangers are folded into the kinship system so that people are clear who is looking after whom. The family networks are widened. Indigenous kinship systems are based upon reciprocity, rituals, and responsibility that seek to include everyone, every person, every animal, every bird, every river, every tree, every mountain has a specific place within its own community, and therefore it becomes a necessity to create a place for new people, either temporary or permanent, to ensure social and cultural cohesion. It does not mean that the new people give up their own culture or cultural identity or traditions or become something or someone else. So we are inclusive. We accept people for who they are. We find them a place within our society, within our community. We will always accept the stranger.
It was very exciting to hear Ray Aldred's paper and that expansion of the imagination of what treaty and covenant should mean. And that provoked in me all sorts of thoughts about how we can connect this conversation with theology of the Hebrew Bible, theology of the Old Testament. Let me just go back a slide to that one where I mentioned Genesis 1. So you may know that the idea of the image of God in Genesis 1 has directly influenced the history of human rights thinking. It's very important to remember that the name of the Creator within which that image of God sits is Elohim and not Yahweh. This is a very deliberate and consistent thing in the first creation narrative. The name of God is the refusal of a national name for God. Do I need to say that again? Elohim, absolutely consistent through all of that first creation narrative, is the refusal, constitutes a refusal of the national name for God. Out of that comes human rights thinking. Genesis 9, again, the priestly theology, it's a covenant for all creation, not just the human beings. That's the first covenant theology, the one that includes the created order. These are foundational texts which come from priestly tradition, as scholars like to call it. Doesn't matter what you call it. It's different from the national theology you have in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy has an understanding of caring for the stranger, but it's folded within a national vision. In the priestly theology, it's much more international. And in the first creation story, it's for everybody. When you come to the Genesis story of Abram, it's firstly Abram, the father of one great nation. We call it the One Nation Party in Australia. Then Abraham, the father of many nations. And if you're a Gentile, that's the one that we connect into. We're not born into Moses. We're not born into that particular Jewish story. We're born into Christ, within which the blessings of Abraham flow, as we see in Galatians 3. Abraham is the father of the many nations, the many covenants. And as we consider what covenant and treaty might mean in Australia, I think that priestly conception of Abraham as the father of many nations is foundational. We are not Jews. We do not live in the story of Israel as the One Nation Party. That could take us a few hours to unpack. Do you want to have any parting words on? Shall I do that? Yeah. Some of you may know some of the local debates that were generated after the Christchurch massacre, and this picture of the New Zealand Prime Minister is now painted on a silo right beside the bicycle path that I ride to work on every day. My working day now finishes riding up a bike path and contemplating this picture. It's a wonderful reminder of what the Christian vocation is all about, as evidenced by a Prime Minister. I don't know her theological commitments, But this is a natural theology. This is the kind of theology that Abraham would be pleased to see. And all I can say is, I wish our Prime Minister understood Abraham as the father of many nations in the way that Jacinda Ardern seems to understand in her political practice. I wish that a Christian Prime Minister, we've had a few of them, could translate the meaning of an international covenant, of an image of God shared by all human beings, inside a covenant with all created beings. I wish they could live up to that, our Christian Prime Ministers.
And as our kingship systems work, like Uncle Ray had said, we are a family. The Bible talks about family. And Mark has given us those interpretations within the biblical scripture that we as Indigenous Australian people live each and every day, of Jesus' love, our cultural way of sharing and caring with one another. Watamoli. Amen.
Amen. I think we're going to need to break now, aren't we, brother?
Yeah. No questions? No, good. No, we can go and sit down, can't we? We don't need to.
Sure, you're going to.
We're going to adjust the schedule, I think, just slightly. Do we have time for questions?
No, we don't.
No? Okay.
Take other people's time.
All right. I would like to say thank you, if I can say thank you. This story, even from Ray this morning, resonates deeply in my heart as one of what we call in Canada the lost generation, or the 60 scoop. So that does impact me. And to hear this with the land and the displacement and coming back together. I've always looked at the Old Testament passages and wondered how this is fit together. And so I'm still figuring this out, but the quote from Edward Said on identity. Thank you so much for doing this and for standing in for Naomi. We miss her, but thank you so much for doing that. And thank you, Mark.
We can do a couple of cues.
Couple questions? Okay, see, we can adjust this. I was thinking if we did 10:30 to 11:30 for our sessions, and then 11:30 to 12:30.
Go 10 minutes and then.
Okay, 10 minutes. So we have a couple questions. If we can do that. Is there anybody that has a question or a comment, reflection, statement back? Right here. Curtis, is that? Oh, okay, sorry. I thought you were running to the microphone.
Over here.
Right there? Okay, stay. You're giving the answers.
Sorry, Sherry.
Okay. Yeah.
So when you look at Jeremiah and you know that it's been a long time coming, that they've been warned, the people of Israel had come from a prosperous King Solomon, an era of prosperity, and they had now been, their souls and spirit and their gratitude toward God had gone so far astray and so into other gods that they had been warned that God would take them and cure them by removing them from their country, and the people react. That pattern, though, goes back in Adam and Eve in the garden. The moment they were also displaced and then pushed out of the garden, and it was guarded. God's used this act of discipline upon a person who's disobedient and or moved against, has broken somehow a trust that he had to garden the garden, So I'm wondering that sometimes I see it more or less like, say, Aboriginal or Indigenous people. My instincts are such to say, or my opinion is such to say, that they seem to be keeping trust. So it's certainly wrong when they're pushed or to apply it as a push. But the people of Israel were under a moment of discipline because their hearts had gone a different place. They weren't acting in a faithful way. But so it seems when you're faithful, the land under your feet is stable. And when you're faithless, God can move you. But then Jesus can be the rock of all souls, even the children who would be born to those generations that are displaced, like Daniel and all those who are displaced, and Esther and all those who were displaced to Babylon. They did have a way back in through love, and I suppose. But I guess my question is, it depends on which side you're sometimes standing on, you know what I'm saying? And you could be born the child of an oppressor who was unaware of how you got there, the sins of your fathers, and is thankful that God is not a God who holds their children, the sins of the father is so guilty on the child, you know what I'm saying? But how do you see that in your... I can feel like there was no sin on the Aboriginal part, but you brought in a whole bunch of people who came from a land who were so at war that those children on those boats would have no idea. Like my ancestor who came to America was shanghaied and forced into, he was a Jewish child in London, forced as a child onto a boat that comes to America. Now, how would that child, who had been as much raised as an Indigenous Indian or Indigenous First Nations person, would have been put in a school? But you take a child as a child and you raise him to be a warrior, he doesn't know, he just told to fight. Do this because those people are that. And then later on, he comes to realize, I was hurting a person who was better than me, and now I want to reconcile. So how do you, look at that? And then...
All right, thank you.
I want to stop talking.
To explain that is that I talk as an Aboriginal person. I don't talk for all Aboriginal people. So you come from your own experience. And for me, my son, people talk about reconciliation. My son is a walking reconciliation. We had protectors in Australia. Now the protector in Queensland, and particularly North Queensland, my husband is a descendant of that. I am the descendant. My grandfather was a slave, and slavery within Aboriginal people is not recognised in our country as yet. So we work through what we are taught by our elders about caring and sharing. And that's the spirituality that we live under, and that's our spiritual law. So our law and our spirituality and our culture are one and the same. So our love for each other is always about caring and sharing. So we walk the path. So it's about what Uncle Ray had said, we walk it. It's just not a theological concept, we actually walk it.
Let me just take up one quick, respond quickly to one element in what you said, and that is to point to the complexity and the debate about intergenerational suffering in Old Testament theology. So many of the older traditions accept that punishment flows across the generations, second and third generation, third and fourth generation. When those people went to Babylon, the next prophet in line said, no, that's not true. Ezekiel. It is not true that the justice of God, that God would want the punishment to go to the innocent children. The question of justice and the question of the justice of God comes to a head at that point, when they're in Babylon, when they're in exile. And the theological effect of that rejection of intergenerational punishment then influences the literature from then on. In fact, when you read Chronicles, it has to tell the whole history of Israel once again in order to make clear that you don't think punishment flows across the generations and God wants that to happen. So stories where it looked like that was the case, Chronicles rewrites it to make sure you don't think that.
Good on you, Mark.
One more
We have
question?
time for one more.
Yeah, they thought they were off the hook. One more? I think you guys want coffee.
Yeah, we do.
All right. We'll run.
Do the announcements for the marketplace.
Okay. We have. Do you want to do that? Or where are they going? I don't have any of that information.
Okay, let's thank Mark and Patricia. All right, so we've made up, this is one of those intriguing Western notions, right, of time. You can waste time, spend time, misuse time, use time, lose time, gain time. It's kind of an interesting thing. So we were out in the back while all of this was happening, and Mark and Patricia were speaking. Several of us were out there, and we did a bit of a time dance and song, and so we have created some time. We were hopeful that it hadn't rained in here and we'd misstepped or something, but anyway.